I never imagined that my nephew would do this. Cristina Garcia exhaled deeply as she reclined against the plush cushions of her sofa, the gentle sound of an afternoon breeze filtering through the slightly open window. It was one of those rare moments when the outside world seemed to pause, leaving her in peaceful solitude within the well-kept suburban home she had carefully cultivated. A half-finished cup of green tea rested on the side table, its heat faded, just like the enthusiasm she once had for her current life. Cristina, 43 years old, had auburn hair that fell in gentle waves beyond her shoulders, giving her an impression of casual beauty. Even to herself, the weight of reflection in her deep green eyes frequently betrayed more than she had intended. Materially, life had been bountiful, but in terms of the heart, it had been less kind. She didn't have any kids of her own, but she loved her 22-year-old godson, Thomas, who was more like a nephew because of their close relationship. Her late best friend's son, Thomas, had spent many summers at this house, but as he matured and went off to university, their visits had become rarer, almost distant. Cristina found herself alone today, or so she believed. After spending most of the morning tidying up the kitchen and sifting through a seemingly endless collection of old photographs, she decided it was time to treat herself. Draped in her favorite silk robe, she sank into the cozy comfort of her sofa, a glass of wine in hand. The soft afternoon light cast delicate shadows across the room as her thoughts wandered freely. The wine, smooth and indulgent, warmed her as she closed her eyes, cherishing the rare moment of tranquility. She didn't notice the car pulling into the driveway or the faint sound of approaching footsteps. Completely absorbed in her solitude, Cristina had no idea Thomas was back. He had returned after realizing he'd left his phone behind during a quick visit the day before. Knowing her habit of leaving the front door unlocked, Thomas stepped inside without hesitation, intending to grab his phone and leave without disturbing her. The door creaked, jolting Cristina, its sound slicing through the silence like a needle on a record. She quickly sat up, her heart racing in her chest. Before she could even straighten her robe, Thomas entered the living room, completely unexpected and unspoken. Aunt, he started, his voice faltering as his eyes took in the scene before him. Cristina froze, her gaze meeting Thomas's, the weight of the moment settling heavily between them. She became painfully aware of how her silk robe clung to her figure, the fabric catching the light in a way that made her feel exposed, despite being covered. Her cheeks burned with a deep blush, embarrassment flooding her as Thomas's wide-eyed expression revealed his own discomfort. "Thomas?" she stuttered, her voice trembling as she instinctively drew the robe tighter around her. "Why are you here?" Thomas quickly looked away, his ears turning red as he awkwardly rubbed the back of his neck. I left my phone here yesterday. I didn't mean to." He gestured vaguely, his words trailing off as he struggled to finish the sentence. The air between them was heavy with unspoken tension, the kind that neither knew how to handle. Cristina felt a flush of heat rise in her chest, her embarrassment deepened by the fact that she had completely let her guard down. Her thoughts raced, desperately searching for something, anything, that could ease the situation. "You should have knocked," she stated, her tone sharper than she intended. The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. They sounded far more accusatory than she had meant. "I'm sorry," Thomas responded quickly, his voice filled with sincerity. I didn't know." Cristina exhaled heavily, running a hand through her hair as she attempted to regain her composure. "It's okay," she replied, though her voice lacked any real conviction. "Just give me a minute." Thomas nodded and stepped back toward the doorway, attempting to give her some space. But the embarrassment hung in the air, unavoidable and stifling. Cristina got up and walked down the hallway, adjusting her robe and wiping invisible lint off the fabric. She tried to regain some control by saying, "I'll get your phone," in a stronger tone. Thomas moved cautiously and uncertainly, pausing before moving away. He responded, "It's on the kitchen counter," in an apologetic tone. Christina made her way to the kitchen, grateful for the brief moment of momentary relief. She leaned against the counter, gripping the edge as she took a deep breath to steady herself. The cool granite under her hands helped her center herself, but the scene kept replaying in her mind, the image of Thomas's face, filled with surprise and something more. Something she couldn't identify? She picked up the phone, her fingers grazing its sleek surface as she let out a measured breath, steadying herself. Walking back to the living room, she extended the phone to Thomas with a strained smile. "Here," she said softly, her tone revealing none of the inner conflict swirling within her. "Thanks," Thomas replied, his voice low. He paused, seemingly searching for the right thing to say, but ultimately remained silent. As he took the phone from her, their fingers brushed for a brief moment. The touch was fleeting, yet it lingered. A subtle spark of something neither could fully grasp, though both undeniably felt. Christina guided him to the door, her steps slow and purposeful. She was ready for the moment to be over, for him to leave so she could return to the peaceful solitude of her afternoon. But just as Thomas stepped onto the porch, he stopped and turned back to her. "I didn't mean to make things awkward," he said, his eyes full of sincerity. "I'm really sorry." Christina gave a small smile, her heart softening despite her best efforts. "It's okay, Thomas. Just knock next time, all right?" He nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "I will. I promise." As he headed to his car, Christina closed the door behind him, leaning against it and letting out a deep breath. The house felt different now. Its silence was no longer soothing, but filled with an energy she couldn't identify. Christina turned back to the sofa, her tea now cold and her wine untouched. Her thoughts swirled uncontrollably, refusing to settle. All afternoon, she tried to dismiss the nagging feeling that something between them had changed. She reassured herself it was nothing more than an awkward moment that would soon pass. But deep down, she knew otherwise. Thomas's gaze, the way her heart had responded, it wasn't something she could easily push aside. As the sun sank lower, stretching long shadows across the room, Christina found herself wondering what the days ahead might hold. The house felt unnaturally quiet, the stillness broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Christina Garcia sat alone at the dining table, her fingers idly tracing circles on the smooth surface of the wood. She had been there for what seemed like hours, though only minutes had passed since Thomas had left, his phone gripped tightly in his hand. The sound of his footsteps fading on the porch still echoed in her mind, blending with the surge of emotions she had fought hard to keep at bay. Her heart pounded relentlessly, a steady rhythm in her chest that refused to calm. She kept her gaze fixed on the table, her thoughts spiraling into a tangled mess of confusion and humiliation. The memory of Thomas standing in the living room, his expression a mix of shock and apology, replayed vividly in her mind, almost taunting her. She felt raw and exposed in a way she hadn't expected, and no amount of reasoning could lighten the heaviness of the moment they had shared. Christina rose abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor as she pushed it back. She needed to act, to do something, anything, to shake off the stifling tension that clung to her like an unwelcome shadow. Her bare feet moved silently across the cool tiles as she drifted into the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as they reached for the sink. She turned on the faucet, the rush of icy water providing a fleeting sense of grounding. She splashed it onto her face, letting the cold jolt her back to reality, even if only for a moment. The relief was fleeting, though, as she straightened and caught sight of her reflection in the window above the sink. The woman staring back at her was almost unrecognizable. Her auburn hair was tousled, her wide green eyes seeking and filled with a nameless emotion she couldn't quite grasp. Shame, guilt, or something more profound. something she wasn't prepared to face. She was startled out of her reverie by the sound of a vehicle engine in the driveway. Christina listened carefully and she froze, her breath seizing in her throat. Her heart pounded again as she heard the creak of the front porch steps. He had returned. Thomas didn't bother knocking this time. The door eased open quietly, and moments later, he stood in the kitchen doorway, his phone still clutched in his hand. His expression was cautious, his dark eyes sweeping the room before settling on her. For a few tense seconds, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching unbearably between them. "I left my charger," he said at last, his voice soft and uncertain. Christina blinked, struggling to find her own words. "It's in the living room," she replied, her tone wavering as if unsure of her own statement. Thomas gave a small nod, his gaze lingering on her briefly before he turned and headed toward the living room. Christina let out a sharp breath, her hands gripping the sink's edge as she tried to steady herself. She could hear him moving in the other room, the faint rustle of fabric and the soft creak of furniture. The ordinary sounds felt heavy, charged in the doorway once more. Christina's glower of displeasure turned to black marks on the torture-bound fabric, and the ordinary sounds felt heavy, charged with an intensity she couldn't shake. Christina's arms were crossed over her chest in an unconscious self-defense motion as she turned to face him. When their gazes locked, the world appeared to shrink until it was only the two of them in the softly lit kitchen. The stillness was broken by Thomas's statement, "I didn't mean to make things awkward." His remarks were cautious, as if he were walking on thin ice, and his tone was earnest. Christina said, "You didn't," far too hastily. She was aware that her strained voice wasn't believable. Thomas moved his weight uneasily, his fingers nervously toying with the charger. "I should have knocked," he confessed, his eyes dropping to the floor. "Didn't even think about it." Christina gave a small nod, her throat tightening. "It's okay, really. Let's just move on." The words felt empty, even as they left her lips. Moving on wasn't an option, not when the moment was burned so vividly into her memory. She could still picture the way his eyes had widened in shock, the way he'd stumbled over his words, trying to explain. And she could still feel the flush in her chest, her heart pounding as if it were trying to break free from her chest. Thomas lifted his gaze, his dark eyes locking with hers once more. There was something in them, something unsaid, something disquieting. That made her breath hitch. "I didn't mean to make you uneasy," he murmured. "You didn't?" Christina replied again, her voice softer this time, though the words felt hollow. She was uneasy, just not in the way he might assume. The silence between them was dense, laden with emotions neither dared to voice. Christina shifted her stance, her fingers clutching the edge of the counter as though it were the only thing keeping her steady. She wanted to speak, to shatter the tension that clung to the room, but her mind was a whirlwind, offering no clarity. "I should go," Thomas finally said, his voice cutting through the stillness. He moved toward the door but paused, glancing back at her over his shoulder. "I'm sorry, Aunt Ash." The nickname, one he had used since childhood, struck her like a sharp reminder of the lines they had always observed, lines that now felt blurred and unsure. "It's okay," Christina murmured, her voice soft and barely audible. "Really?" Thomas nodded before leaving. The door closing behind him created an almost deafening silence. Christina remained standing there for a long time, her hands gripping the counter as she stared at the empty doorway. Her mind replayed every moment of their exchange with a clarity that felt almost painful. She attempted to dismiss it, telling herself it was just an awkward encounter they would both move on from, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The tension that lingered between them wasn't something easily ignored. It was a spark, small yet undeniable, that threatened to evolve into something far more complex than she was ready to confront. As Christina switched off the kitchen light and retreated to the solitude of her bedroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the start of something. Something had shifted between them, something she couldn't quite define but couldn't dismiss either. She pondered how long they could continue to act as though nothing had changed, while she lay awake in the darkness of moonlight on the ceiling. Christina couldn't tell how or when it had happened, but the air in the home had shifted. It was faint, almost undetectable, yet it stuck to the walls, occupying the gaps between her and Thomas and lingering in the quiet. Days had gone by since their embarrassing meet, but no matter how hard she tried to push it away or tell herself it was only a brief moment of shame, the memory of it kept coming back to her, repeating itself with ruthless accuracy. The strain between them wouldn't go away. Christina became increasingly aware of everything around her. Thomas's footsteps through the house seemed louder, more purposeful. His voice carried, each word heavy with meaning that she couldn't ignore. Even their brief exchanges, passing by in the hallway or exchanging pleasantries in the kitchen, felt charged with a silent energy neither of them acknowledged. He smiled at the way she said, "It was on a Sunday afternoon that Christina felt the weight of it most." She sat in the living room, curled up on the sofa with a book in her lap. Though she had ceased reading long ago, the words blurred as her mind drifted, consumed by thoughts she couldn't get away. Except for the odd rustle of leaves outside and the soft hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen, the home was still. She hadn't seen Thomas all morning, but she was very much aware that he was above. The soft creak of the staircase pierced the silence, making her heart jump. Christina stiffened, her grip tightening on the book as his footsteps echoed down the stairs. Forcing herself to stay calm, she exhaled deeply and glanced up just as Thomas stepped into the room. "Hey," he greeted, his tone light but carrying a subtle hint of uncertainty. "Hey," Christina replied, her voice steady and deliberate. She closed the book and placed it aside, straightening her posture. "Did you sleep okay?" "Yeah, I think so," he said, raking a hand through his hair. He lingered in the doorway, seeming torn between stepping further inside or leaving. After a brief hesitation, he moved further into the room, his steps measured and intentional. Christina's eyes followed him, her pulse quickening despite her efforts to stay calm. She despised how acutely aware she was of him, the lingering gaze of his dark eyes, the way his presence seemed to envelop the room, both soothing and disconcerting at once. She shifted in her seat, crossing her legs in an attempt to project a sense of poise. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked, her tone a touch too cheerful, a bit too forced. Thomas gave a small shake of his head, a faint smile playing at the edge of his lips. "No, I'm fine." Yeah." A strained silence settled between them, stretching like a fragile thread, ready to snap under the weight of unspoken words. Christina's eyes drifted to the coffee table, where an empty wine glass sat, a detail she had overlooked. Its presence felt glaring, a quiet reminder of the vulnerability she had exposed in recent days. "I was thinking of heading out for a bit," Thomas ultimately said, breaking the silence. "Maybe take a walk or something?" "That sounds nice," Christina replied, her voice polite but detached. She picked up her book again, flipping to the page she had left on, even though she knew concentrating would be impossible. Thomas lingered for a moment, as if expecting her to say more, but when she didn't, he gave a small nod and walked away. Christina watched him disappear, feeling a slight release of the tension in her chest as his footsteps faded down the hall. However, the relief was fleeting, quickly replaced by a persistent unease she couldn't ignore. Later that evening, Christina found herself in the kitchen, preparing dinner with an almost obsessive accuracy. Christina chopped the vegetables with careful precision, the steady sound of the knife on the cutting board offering a small sense of comfort in the otherwise quiet house. Thomas had come back from his walk hours earlier, but he had kept to himself, and Christina appreciated the solitude. She was stirring a pot on the stove when she heard him enter. Without turning around, she stayed focused on her task as she sensed his presence drawing near. It was a warm, almost tangible energy that filled the room. "Smells good," he commented, his voice breaking the silence. "Thanks," Christina responded curtly, continuing to sprinkle salt into the pot with a steady hand. "It'll be ready soon." Thomas didn't reply right away, and when she finally glanced back, she saw him leaning against the counter, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on her. There was something in his expression, curiosity perhaps, or something more profound, that made her heartbeat quicken. "You're awfully quiet today," he said, his tone light but with an undercurrent of inquiry. Christina shrugged, turning her attention back to the stove. "Just busy," she replied, keeping her voice even. "Busy avoiding me?" Thomas asked. Though his words carried a teasing note, there was a subtle sharpness that made her stomach churn. Christina froze, her grip tightening on the spoon as she tried to steady herself. She forced a laugh, though it rang hollow even to her own ears. "Don't be absurd." Thomas moved away from the counter, stepping closer until he was right beside her. "Am I, though?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more intent. Christina turned to face him, her heart racing as her eyes locked with his. There was something in his gaze, a resolve that both frightened and excited her. Christina started to say something, but before she could, Thomas extended his hand and lightly touched hers. The touch was electric, sending a surge of energy through her. She stood still, her breath catching as she stared at their hands. She knew she should pull away, should stop it before things escalated, but she couldn't. The intensity of the moment, the feelings that had been growing between them, kept her rooted to the spot. "Christina," Thomas murmured, his voice barely audible, "tell me I'm wrong. Tell me you don't feel it too." Her gaze lifted to meet his, searching his eyes for something, anything, that could make this less complicated. But all she found was raw sincerity, disarming her completely. "Thomas," she started, her voice unsteady. This isn't right, but it feels right, doesn't it?" He pressed, his tone soft, yet persistent. Christina felt her resolve falter. The barriers she had carefully constructed around her heart began to crumble under the weight of his words. She wanted to refute him, to create distance, but the undeniable truth gnawed at her. It did feel right. Right in a way that defied all reason. With one tear streaming down her face, she closed her eyes and said softly, "I don't know." Thomas leaned up and carefully brushed away the tear, his fingers caressing her face. "I do," he responded quietly, "and I believe that you do as well." It was then that the tension between them became unbearable. Only raw emotion and the unspoken bond that had been growing between them remained, when the barriers they had painstakingly upheld vanished. Christina had the opportunity to back away when Thomas leaned in and his motion slowed, but she chose not to. Then, everything was different. The night carried an eerie stillness, the kind that seemed to infiltrate every corner of the house. Outside, the moon hung low, its pale glow spilling long, silvery shadows over the lawn. Inside, the air was heavy with a tension that had been simmering for days, a quiet storm waiting to erupt. Christina sat at the dining table, her fingers idly tracing the edge of her untouched wine glass. The room was dim, with the soft glow of the chandelier casting gentle shadows across her face. She had attempted to distract herself with trivial tasks, answering emails, flipping through a magazine, but her thoughts refused to settle. The events of the past week replayed in her mind, every moment, every glance, every word adding to the emotional weight she struggled to bear. The faint creak of the stairs reached her ears before she saw him. Her pulse raced, a familiar rhythm she both dreaded and, if she were honest, anticipated. She looked up, just as Thomas entered the room, his presence commanding even in the simplicity of the moment. He paused in the doorway, hands buried in the pockets of his jeans, his dark eyes scanning the space before finally landing on her. Something in Thomas had changed tonight, a quiet intensity in his stare that made her pulse race. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Thomas shook his head, stepping deeper into the room. "No, and I don't think you could either." Christina gave a small, tight smile. "Thoughts racing?" He nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. The large, sturdy table seemed almost fragile, a barrier between them. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence was thick, pressing in on them until it became unbearable. "I need to say something," Thomas said at last, his voice low but determined, carrying a weight that made Christina's heart constrict. She placed her glass down gently, her fingers trembling. "Thomas, please, just let me," he said, maintaining eye contact with her. "I can't keep this inside anymore. Sleep." Christina watched him try to find the perfect words and stopped, her breath trapped in her throat. She felt heartbroken by the rawness and vulnerability in his look. He said, "I don't know when it started," in a steady but emotionally charged voice. "It may have been that evening in the kitchen, or it might have been earlier. I simply know that something has changed, and I can no longer deny it." Christina's stomach twisted, a blend of unease and an unidentifiable emotion washing over her. "Thomas, you don't have to." "I do," he interrupted firmly, leaning forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing anchoring him. "You need to know how I feel." The room seemed to close in, the walls pressing tighter as Christina's thoughts raced. She wanted to stop him, to look away, but she couldn't. She was frozen in place, ensnared by his words, his eyes, his presence. "I think about you constantly," he said, his voice soft but no less intense. "When I'm with you, nothing else matters. And when I'm not, all I can do is wish I were." Christina's breath caught, her heart pounding so fiercely she was sure he could hear it. She shook her head, her voice unsteady as she finally managed to speak. "Thomas, this isn't... we can't..." In a tone that was almost imploring, he said, "Well? Not what? Why do we have to keep pretending like there's nothing here?" She said, "Because it's intricate," in a broken voice. "Because it's not right." "But it feels right," Thomas remarked as he looked into her eyes. "You can't tell me you don't feel it too." Christina averted her gaze, her hands clutching her lap as she struggled to compose herself. The truth lingered in the air, undeniable and inescapable. She felt it. The connection, the magnetic pull, the unexplainable bond that had grown between them. Yet admitting it felt like stepping into the unknown, and she wasn't ready to take that leap. "I'm not sure," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas rose, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor as he moved around the table. He knelt beside her, his presence intense yet comforting as he reached for her hand. "You do know," he said gently, "and so do I." His touch was warm and steady, anchoring her in a moment that felt fragile, as though it could break apart at any second. Christina's eyes brimmed with tears, the weight of her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She looked down at him, her breath catching as their eyes met. "This isn't fair," she murmured in a quivering voice. "To you? It's not about fair," Thomas stated in a soft yet determined tone. "To me? It's about what's real. Ah. Christina attempted to keep herself together as she closed her eyes and let a single tear fall down her cheek. She didn't know how to stop the wall she had put up around herself, the shields she had so meticulously kept up, from collapsing. She said, "I don't know how to do this," in a voice that broke. Thomas responded, "You don't have to," as he gripped her hand more tightly. "We'll figure it out together." Page seated himself. His words weighed heavily on everyone, and the room went silent again. Christina's heart ached from the impossibly difficult decisions she had to make, and her mind was racing with feelings. She wanted to trust him and believe in their connection, but she was unable to do so because she was afraid of what may happen. The night dragged on as they sat there, each moment weighed down by the unspoken vows and unresolved queries between them. Christina couldn't help but question whether she had already gone too far and couldn't get back. Morning light filtered gently through the curtains, casting the room in a blend of golden hues and soft shadows. Christina stirred in her bed, her eyes fluttering open to the subdued hum of the world awakening beyond the walls. For a brief moment, she lingered in that fragile space between sleep and awareness, feeling as though time had paused, but the weight of reality soon crept in, unyielding and heavy, as the memories of the previous night surged back with startling clarity, quickening her pulse. She sat up slowly, her breathing uneven, and pressed her hands against her face. The house felt stifling in its stillness, every sound magnified in the quiet. The faint groan of the floorboards, the gentle rustling of leaves outside. Each noise appeared to mirror the storm within her. Christina let her hands rest on her lap, her gaze wandering toward the window. The sky was a brilliant blue, the sun steadily ascending, oblivious to the turmoil brewing inside her. Her mind replayed every detail, every word spoken, every glance exchanged. Thomas's voice, raw with sincerity, echoed in her thoughts. His confession, his touch, the unguarded vulnerability in his eyes. These moments were etched into her memory, inescapable and consuming. A whirlwind of emotions surged within her. Guilt, confusion, yearning, all competing for control, each tugging her in a different direction. Swinging her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet met the cool surface of the hardwood floor. She stood shakily, wrapping her arms around herself as she shuffled toward the bathroom. The mirror above the sink reflected a version of her she barely recognized. Her auburn hair was disheveled, and her blue eyes were shadowed with exhaustion from a sleepless night. She sprayed cold water on her face, hoping it might lift the heavy burden pressing against her chest. The relief, however, was short-lived. As she stepped back into the bedroom, her gaze landed on the chair by the window where her sweater hung. It was the same sweater she had worn the previous night, the one Thomas had brushed against when he knelt beside her. The memory sent her pulse racing, and she shook her head, as though the motion could banish the thoughts threatening to consume her. From downstairs, the faint sound of clinking dishes broke the stillness. Christina froze, her heart skipping a beat as it dawned on her that she wasn't alone. Thomas. His presence was almost tangible, even from afar, and her stomach churned with a mix of anticipation and unease. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she began walking down the stairs. The kitchen was flooded with sunlight, casting a warm glow that brought out the room's simplicity. Thomas stood at the counter, his back to her, moving with intention as he poured a cup of coffee. Dressed casually, his dark hair was a bit messy as if he had spent the night lost in thought. The sight of him, both familiar and somehow different, caused Christina to hesitate in the doorway. Christina considered his presence, communing with him, however insecure. He inclined his head. "Morning," she said softly, her voice gentler than she meant. Thomas turned, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment there was only silence, stretching between them like something delicate. Then He gave a small, uncertain smile. Morning. Christina entered the room, her movements slow and cautious, as if treading carefully around something fragile. She reached for a mug, her hands trembling as she poured herself coffee. The air between them was heavy, charged with unspoken words. "How did you sleep?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence. Christina glanced at him, her lips forming a faint, strained smile. "Not well." Thomas gave a small nod, his expression pensive. "Same here." For a moment they stood quietly, the soft clink of Christina's spoon against her mug filling the space. She avoided his gaze, focusing on the cream swirling and dissolving into her coffee. Yet she could feel his eyes on her, his presence pressing down on her chest like a weight. "I meant what I said last night," Thomas said abruptly, his voice calm but gentle. Christina's hands stopped mid-motion, her breath hitching. She lifted her gaze, her green eyes searching his for answers she wasn't ready to face. "Thomas, I know it's not easy," he interrupted, stepping closer. "I know you're scared. I am too. But that doesn't alter how I feel." Christina placed her mug on the counter, her hands shaking as she leaned against it for support. Closing her eyes, she struggled to piece together the right words. "We can't just act like this never happened," she finally murmured, her voice soft and unsteady. "I'm not acting like that," Thomas replied firmly. "And I don't think you are either." Turning to face him, Christina felt her chest tighten as her eyes locked with his. "Do you even understand what you're saying? What you're asking of me?" "I do," he answered calmly. "I know it's not fair, but I also know that, whatever this is between us, it's real." His words lingered in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Christina felt her determination falter. She wanted to refute him, to insist he was wrong, but the undeniable truth was staring back at her. The bond between them, the magnetic pull that had been growing for days, was undeniable. "I don't know how to do this," she confessed, her voice unsteady. "I don't even know where to begin." Thomas extended his hand, his fingers lightly brushing against hers. The touch sent a spark through her, reigniting the emotions she had worked so hard to push aside. "We'll figure it out," he said gently. "Together." Christina's gaze dropped to their hands, her breath catching as she wrestled with the torrent of feelings surging within her. She wanted to pull away, to retreat into the safety of denial, but she couldn't. The link between them was too powerful, too genuine to ignore. She eventually murmured, "We can't rush this," in a voice that was almost audible. "We need to be careful." With a sincere gaze, Thomas nodded. "I understand, and I'll do as you say. I'm here for everything you need." Christina's chest ached from the earnestness in his speech and the unflinching support in his gaze. Taking a deep breath, she tried to stabilize herself by clamping her fingers on the counter's edge. "We'll talk later," she said, her voice now firmer. "I just need some time to think." "Take all the time you need," Thomas replied softly. "I'm here." Christina gave a small nod, her eyes lowering to her mug as she tried to steady herself. The tension in the room had lessened slightly, though the weight of their discussion still hung in the air, a quiet reminder of the decisions yet to come. As Thomas walked out, Christina remained behind, standing alone as sunlight poured through the window, casting elongated shadows on the floor. She took a slow sip of her coffee, the warmth anchoring her as her gaze drifted to the view outside. She had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. Everything was different now, and there was no going back. That's the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the content, please give us a thumbs up and share it with your friends and family. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, love 30K Stories, and turn on notifications to stay current with all our future uploads. Your support is incredibly important to us. Take care, and see you soon.